How the United States got so many Confederate monuments. This 2015 photo shows Civil War Confederate figures from left, President Jefferson Davis, General Robert E. Lee, and General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, carved into the rock at Stone Mountain, Georgia. Following the deadly violence during an August 12, 2017 white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, a Democratic candidate for Georgia governor said the carvings should be removed. Every statue in every town has its own story, but taken together, the roughly 700 Confederate statues and monuments in the United States tell a story. Many of them are much newer than one might think. The Southern Poverty Law Center is a law firm in Montgomery, Alabama. It focuses on civil rights issues. It put together a list of these monuments last year. This list shows that these monuments are spread over 31 states. Many of these states were not among the 11 Confederate states that seceded from the Union before the Civil War. Most of these monuments did not go up after the war ended in 1865. Most monuments commemorating the Civil War were built to honor dead soldiers. It could be found in cemeteries. Later, towns started to construct other Confederate monuments. Civil War glorification. Most Confederate monuments or statues were built between the 1890s and 1950s when segregation was at its height. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center's report, the biggest spike in monument building was between 1900 and the 1920s. But these monuments were not built to honor soldiers who had died. Instead, they were often of the leaders of the Confederacy. General Robert E. Lee was one of these leaders. Another was President of the Confederate States, Jefferson Davis. Also popular was General Thomas Stonewall Jackson. All of them were there to teach values to people, Mark Elliott says. Elliott is a professor of history at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. That's why they put them in the city squares. That's why they put them in front of state buildings. The values they stood for, he says, included a glorification of the cause of the Civil War. Stone Mountain Project. White women's groups played a large sorry. White women's groups played a huge role in raising money to build the Confederate markers. The United Daughters of the Confederacy was founded in the 1890s. It had the greatest influence of any group, Elliott says. It was responsible for creating a giant stone carving of Davis, Lee, and Jackson in Stone Mountain, Georgia. It was begun in the 1910s and completed in the 1960s. By the 1960s, fewer new Confederate monuments were being made, yet the Confederate battle flag was as popular as ever. In 1956, Georgia redesigned its state flag to include it. 6 years later, the South Carolina placed the flag atop its Capitol building. Take them down today. Protesters and city officials have taken down statues in Baltimore and Durham, North Carolina recently. Many cities are calling for their elected state officials to do the same. Two of Stonewall Jackson's great great grandsons are among them. They have written an open letter to the mayor of Richmond, Virginia. A statue of Stonewall Jackson stands there. We are writing today to ask for the removal of this statue, as well as the removal of all Confederate statues from Monument Avenue, they wrote in their letter. Even Robert E. Lee V, who greatly respects his great great grandfather, supports the removal of his statues. If it can avoid